Cuban mercenaries have reportedly fragged a Russian regimental commander. Just how did this happen? What are Cubans doing in Russia? And we're also going to cover the huge surge in Russian artillery production. It's a bunch of stories, and we're going to cover all of them right now. Let's get into it.
And killed Russian regiment commander. Cuban mercenaries fighting in the Pokrovsky direction in the Donetsk region killed their commander of the 400.
Okay, so let's talk for a second of where this is taking place. So this actually identifies as Pokrovsky in the Donetsk area. So I think that puts it in this region here. I believe that's quite a ways behind the front lines. Let's see if I can find it. Here you go. Here's Pokrovsk in Donetsk. I'm sorry. It's actually, I guess they've identified it as being in this Ultra front line. This is one of the sites of the heaviest fighting of the entire conflict. And it makes sense that Russia is using some of its foreign nationals in this sort of high risk fighting. The reason is, of course, because the Russian public already starting to sour on this war because of not just the casualties, but the extremely high price the Russian government is paying for this. This entire conflict right now, they think about 35% of all Russian federal spending is devoted to this war effort. So when you're going to have these high casualty units, it's just politically easier for Russia to have them be foreign nationals. And so, as they're making this drive toward Pokrovsk, it seems like the Cubans were not having it. Now, I also want to point out that the footage here we're looking at is actually training footage. So please, 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 YouTube, don't demonetize me.
128th Motorized Rifle Regiment for humiliation. The Atesh Telegram channel reported the traffic agent from the headquarters of the Center Group of Troops of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation noted that the reason for the execution was regular humiliation.
Okay, so this is really interesting for a couple of reasons. First off, you notice they kind of obliquely reference what that was about, and they said it was a traffic group. Now, military traffic is subject to a somewhat different set of standards, and usually what that means is that military traffic is a term for ensuring that the right people and resources get to the front lines. As we've talked about, right? Imagine there's some estimates put around 10 to 15,000 troops in this breach here, and you've got to supply them with food, with water, with munitions. You've got to give them construction materials to build fortifications, right? They need water. They need fresh troops because Russia is assuming a massive amount of casualties as they do this. They need repair parts for vehicles, whole fresh vehicles. It's a lot of stuff, and they have a very narrow set of roadways to do it in, sometimes no roadways at all. So you can imagine that deciding who gets to use the road when is a massive undertaking, and ensuring that things are continually moving. So military traffic is actually a very sophisticated job. And it wouldn't shock me if you told me that a lot of Cubans are doing behind the lines kind of support work. That also would not surprise me because I've heard actually that many of the recruiters that operate in this region, while some of them straight up lie and tell them, hey, you're going to be working in a behind the lines construction, fortification, building type job. And then they flip the script and send them to assault units. I suspect that maybe some of these recruiters are actually honest, and Russia's sitting there going, okay, listen, we'll pay you, for example, a third of what your combat peers will do, but we'll guarantee you that you'll be serving in a traffic coordinator role. You'll be a truck driver. You'll be something. Actually, a truck driver is probably pretty high risk, but you'll be doing some kind of behind the lines work. And that wouldn't shock me at all, again, because we know Russia desperate to scale up its manpower using basically every method possible.
Beatings and confiscation of salaries from migrant workers from Latin America. The direct executors of the execution have already been transferred to the Rostov region of the Russian Federation. The command of the regiment appealed to the general staff with a request to replace foreign mercenaries with Russian soldiers.
So this is really interesting, right? And it's interesting for a couple of reasons. First off, the Ukrainian forces don't really, so they have some foreign volunteers, but they do not have large-scale foreign mercenaries like we see here in the Russian Federation. And the Cubans are such favored conscripts, for lack of a better term, because they are all military trained, right? Here, let me pull up some of the data here, right? In Cuba, since 1991, all able-bodied men are obligated to enlist in the military between 16 and 28. However, most are called up to service at around 17. And the result is that basically every 20-something in Cuba has military basic training. So that it means that they can engage operate a rifle, they can listen to an NCO's commands, they can use a grenade, right? They can employ not just military gear, they can employ Soviet military gear. And what's even more interesting is that actually the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, when they have large groups of Cuban refugees, they try really hard to break them up. They don't want 40 or 50 Cubans in one place because they have this military background. They sort of self-organize very quickly into quasi-military units, which means they can sit there and if they want to, cause a disruption. Sometimes they can actually take advantage of other migrants, right? Operating as a sort of gang. But oftentimes they will just simply advocate for themselves in a way that's like dangerous. Again, if you were a station with 10 Border Patrol agents and you said, man, these 40 Cubans are all under the command, they have an officer and they have 2 NCOs, and they know how to follow orders and work together, they can go on a hunger strike, they can try to leave, they can engage in other forms of protest, they can even barricade themselves in a place, they can cause a lot of problems. And so it's a interesting societal change, for lack of a better term, when you have this large scale number of people who are military trained. It really changes the dynamic, and Russia is taking advantage of this.
The mercenaries.
But the problem is that in Russia, they also have conscripts. And it sounds like they're treating these conscripts much like a Russian conscript, where, again, stealing salaries, beatings, pointless humiliations, those are endemic in the treatment of Russian conscripts, right? They're also underpaid, right? And it kind of, it's one of those things that's like circular logic, right? Because if you're a commander, who's going to be more motivated? The person who volunteered to be there, or the conscript who was literally forced to be there under penalty of law, right? So who's going to need more supervision, more motivation, more careful watching for bad behavior, right? It's going to be the person who was forced to be here, the conscript. As a result, the conscripts are routinely treated like cattle, like garbage, right? Salaries are stolen. They're beaten. They are often forced to do these humiliating acts of service to older conscripts, or even older contract soldiers. So all of that sort of is getting poured onto these Cubans who, despite the fact that they aren't conscripts, they're volunteers and they have military training, they don't speak the same language as the Russian commanders. And so likely the Russian commanders simply treat them like they're idiots. That's my theory, is that they're not actually idiots. They're probably smart guys, but because they don't speak Russian, the Russian's like, this guy's dumb. He doesn't know what blah, 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 blah means. But it's like, dude, if you just translated to Spanish, I'm sure they would do it.
Added that such situations arise in the enemy army from time to time, but they do not become publicly known. Across much of Cuba, the economy has ground to a standstill as the communist-run island reels from a sharp drop in tourism, spiking inflation and renewed US sanctions. In places like Santa Clara, a city of around 250,000 people with frequent hours-long daily blackouts and more horses and carts on the road than cars, there was seemingly an unlimited number of disaffected men to recruit. For months, hundreds of Cubans have quietly left the island to fight for Russia in its war in Ukraine, chasing promises of money and Russian citizenship from shadowy online recruiters.
This is also a huge appeal, right? For a Cuban, getting into Europe, into Russia is a huge deal. And you know, when you look at the GDP per capita, right? Sometimes in the West we say, like, oh, you know, Cuba, Russia, they're all kind of poor countries. You know, they're all equally bad. That is absolutely not the case. Here you can see this is GDP per capita in Cuba versus the Russian Federation. In Cuba, right, you could see in 2020 at least, the 2020 you're looking at about 10,000 US dollars per person, right? Obviously, it's not distributed like that, but that's about where you're at. In contrast, the current Russian Federation GDP per capita, 50% higher, right? So it's a sign that this is just a healthier, more thriving economy. And remember, that is returning to a 2013 level of the Russian Federation, right? You can see that for about 10 years, they were actually like kind of competitive, right? The Cuban economy steadily growing as tourism, and increasing openings, the government became more open. But then, of course, in the last 2 years, if this is to be believed, you're probably seeing a huge decrease. And so this is probably more like twice, like double the GDP per capita of Cuba. So again, if you're a Cuban national, the idea of getting to live in a country that has an economy twice the size, twice the productiveness of yours, is a huge appeal.
The open recruiting threatened to set back Russia's relations with their former Cold War ally Cuba. Since the war began, Cuban officials had increasingly echoed Russian propaganda that NATO aggression was to blame for its invasion of Ukraine. Russia, in turn, sent more shipments of crude oil to the island and promised greater foreign investment. Still, Cuban officials appear to have demonstrated forcefully that they were refusing to become directly involved in the war by allowing their citizens to serve in the Russian military with explicit Cuban state approval. For those Cubans fighting for money on the other side of the world, their choices now seem to be exile in a war zone or prosecution and a lengthy jail sentence back home.
Interesting. So it sounds like that may not be the case. It may be a little bit like, I think it's closer to the United States, where legally it is pretty fraught to serve in a foreign military. It's not a crime per se, but there's a lot of times where it's not allowed, right? And I think there are some laws that you would technically violate, but in the case of foreign volunteers, especially for militaries that are aligned with the United States, like the YPG and the Kurds, or the International Foreign Legion of Ukraine, those formations seem to just sort of get a pass. The U.S. goes, it's not worth it for us to prosecute these guys, which is itself kind of interesting. And I suspect the Cuban government probably operates under a similar set of protocols. Now, here's the thing, guys. Cuba is also in a massive economic crisis, right? And I want to point this out here. You could see this is from just a couple of weeks ago, the 18th of March. It sounds like the Cuban crisis is really bad. Huge blackouts, large food shortages. Again, the Cubans are, of course, blaming the United States, but the United States has had Cuba under an embargo for the better part of 80 years. So to say that the U.S. is responsible is pretty silly. You also, of course, have a tourism industry that's really, really diminished for Cuba, right? Cuba, the state, depending on a lot on tourism from Europeans and from Latin Americans, but a lot of them are just sort of, it seems like Cuba kind of opened up, and now the reputation, though, is much worse. People have kind of identified, right? There's a point where in a tourism industry where your country is so poor that tourists don't want to be there, right? You don't have the infrastructure. You don't have an appropriate hotel. You don't have roads to get to you that are safe to get to your tourism destinations, right? You don't have the infrastructure to support, the construction of a resort, right? And then there's a point where you're a little wealthier, where tourists get to experience a high quality of life. They get to go to nice restaurants and eat good food and have nice drinks and see some cool sights and do some shopping. But they can access it at a cheaper rate because of both the smaller economy and because of favorable currency conditions, right? And that's the sweet spot you want to be in as a tourism country, right? And the problem with Cuba is Cuba's just about there. All right. I've never talked to somebody that's gone to Cuba and been like, it was nice, right? It's like, imagine if the government ran a resort. Like, everything would just be kind of screwed up, right? It wouldn't be responsive in the way that a free market economy can really be, And so that, I think, is the problem that Cuba's facing ultimately, is that there's just a slowdown in tourism. The government can't take their cut, and the government provides so many other services that now they find themselves in a economic crisis. And if there's one thing, truthfully, the Cuban government, especially when it sees a lot of protests, this is true of any government. You notice who's protesting, right? Let's look more closely at this photo, right? Who do you see? Military-aged men. Right? Let's see if we can zoom it in a little bit more here. Right? Look who's in this photo of the protests. Military-aged man, military-aged man, military-aged man, military-aged man, military-aged man, military-aged man, military-aged man. Huge numbers of these folks are military-aged men. In a country, when you have mass protests, you have a bunch of military-trained guys, and they don't have work, and they don't have food, and they don't have electricity. Guess what? Your government kind of wants them to get out. If they say, listen, we can take these guys and you can send them to Russia. And even worse, Russia may sit there and go, listen, dudes, we'll write the Cuban government a check. We'll subsidize you mobilizing your armed forces to fight in this special military operation. And for the Cuban government, that may look like a pretty good deal. A big influx of cash, support from a major European country, and you get to take your problem citizens, those military-aged men who are disaffected and trained, and you get to ship them to the other side of the world for a while. Don't be shocked if the Cuban government takes that offer. Anyway, guys, if you want access to exclusive combat footage, or combat footage rather, and my analysis, you want to become a member of combatvetnews.com, right? I can't show combat footage here on this channel. YouTube will demonetize me. YouTube absolutely hates small creators. I don't know what else to tell you. But if you want to support me and the team and what we do, any one of these tiers is going to get you access to the twice a week combat footage. I find the most recent stuff from the front lines, and we do a deep dive analysis, trying to figure out where it takes place, trying to figure out the tactics, the protocols, what exactly both sides are doing and what they're trying to achieve. Again, any one of these tiers will get you access, but if you want to support what I do and you want the shout outs at the end of the video, the lieutenant tier or even the colonel tier, hugely appreciated. But check it out, combatvetnews.com. Link is in the description. Okay, two other stories I thought were really important. First, Russia is found to be producing 3 times more artillery shells than the U.S. and Europe combined. And I've talked about this before, right? The United States, after 20 years of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where there was no massed artillery, right? The U.S. kind of deluded itself. It said, listen, modern wars, they're not fought with artillery. They're fought with planes and munitions. But at the end of the day, the ability to lob an explosive at somebody is just too good to pass up. And so the U.S. dropped its artillery production capabilities. And Russia, though, never did. So Russia can make now 250,000 artillery rounds every single month, 3 million a year. In contrast, the US and Europe at max capacity could generate less than half of that, right? Now, the US's goal by 2025 is to ramp that up to 100,000 rounds a month, right? But that's less than half of the Russian current monthly output. Oh, and Russia is still ramping up its artillery production. And so to me, it's a sign that Russia is willing to open up its pocketbooks and go hard in this war, right? This is one of the problems, is that there's in a way, 3 tiers of country in this war. Ukraine is fighting a war for survival. It's the only country at the bottom tier where Ukraine has to go all in, because if it fails as a state, it ceases to exist. The next tier is Russia. Russia is a belligerent in this war, but it's not existential. The Russian state, if it loses, the Russian state will still exist. The Russian people will still exist, right? But it's gone all in, and it's going to stay all in, right? Then the next tier up are these supporting countries. These are countries with, like the United States and Europe, where they sit there and go, we have an incentive to see Russia lose. We don't want to see Ukraine win. It's going to send a message to our other allies that, never. It's going to send a message to our allies that say, never get on the wrong side of a dictator. And so what you end up with is a commitment issue, right? Russia is committed to making a lot of artillery rounds. And because it's an industrialized European country, it can do it, right? US and Europe, listen, if we really wanted to, we could produce 10 million rounds a month if we were in an existential war. But the problem is politicians, they're not all in. They're like, listen, what can we do reasonably that's going to not upset the existing contractors, that's not going to disrupt existing contracts? We got to make sure everybody that's making the rounds is in a union, and the union gets its back scratched. And, we got to adhere to all the safety and regulations about where things can be stored and where they can be made, and da-da-da. It's a lot, right? And so when your sort of commitment is diffuse like that, it's hard to go all in. You think Russia gives a shit about safety at those munitions plants? Fuck no. They don't give a fuck at all. At all. Anyway, guys, just another perspective for you. A huge thank you to the members of combatvetnews.com. I really appreciate you guys. Thanks to our Colonel tier members. Thanks to our Lieutenant tier members and all the members. Be sure to join us over there. We're checking out a look at the fighting from the Battle of Ultra Latina today. So I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.